the majority, the responsibility of the churches in a majority culture. But point number two, and this is the harder one to say. As I said, my position brings me into contact with Christians in the Middle East who are in the minority and who have certain anxieties. One of their anxieties is, in fact, the very process of dialogue that Western Christians are eager to have with Middle Eastern Muslims, because they feel that this is power speaking to power, and that in that process of dialogue, the less powerful are left out of the equation. In this case, both the Muslims of this country and the Christians of the Middle East. So one question I put before you is, would it be useful to have a dialogue between Muslims of the United States and Christians of the Middle East to talk about some of these majority-minority relationships? That's a question I put out there. But secondly, I would be less than faithful to them if I did not at least convey some of the anxiety they feel at this point in history. And it relates to the question I asked earlier of Dr. Badawi. And perhaps we can explore his answer a bit more. It has to do with the question of authority. Christians in the Middle East say to me, we have been part of this culture for centuries. We feel that we are part of Islamic culture, even if we have not become Muslims. We take part and take pride in Islamic culture. It is ours in that sense. The difference in the new age that we are facing is the inestimable power of the nation state, which has not been part of the Christian-Muslim reality in the Middle East in the past. The nation state is a relatively new phenomenon, and certainly the power of the nation state to enter into the lives of people in the way that it can is a relatively new phenomenon. Where Christians in the Middle East have expressed anxiety is to say, where is that authority that we can turn to that will be reliable? Who do we listen to? In a way, I think it's a restatement of Ivan's question. Who do we listen to in this new age to see where we fit into Islamic society? I think those are the kinds of questions that perhaps are even more important than the technicalities that we will, I'm sure, be touching. We've already touched on them to some extent about permission to build churches or mosques or rights of proselytization, a whole question of apostasy laws. I'm sure we'll get into that. But I think I would hope that at least we have some time to discuss some of these underlying concerns that go beyond the legality but have a reality in people's lives that give them anxieties and hopes for the future.
Thank you.
I'd like first to tell you what I was planning to do. One is to raise the issue of dhimmis. I'll come to that word. And why is it that Islam divides people into Muslims and non-Muslims? Isn't that discriminatory? Does that give them a second-class position? Secondly, one remark again about the underlying or underpinning of Muslim attitude towards minority. And thirdly, that's the most important part, the duties and responsibilities. First of all, as you know, in nation states today, people are divided basically on rigid things that cannot be changed, that you cannot really change by language or skin color or others. Islam, being based on belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, chose to divide people differently. That classification of Muslim and non-Muslim, as we'll see, is not a classification of superior, inferior in terms of treatment, and we'll try to show that in a minute, especially when we explain the true meaning of dhimmi. A lot of people took the word dhimmi as an insult, and they lack the understanding between status or a state and a contract. Dhimma comes from the Arabic term which means covenant, and dhimmi means the covenanted people, the minority who are not Muslim living under the protection of Islam. And dhimma actually literally means that they had the covenant of God, His Messenger, and the believers, the Muslims, that their rights shall be protected and not infringed upon. In fact, I find that more advantageous than not having that distinction at all. If in a democracy, for example, you say, all right, everybody is the same, let's make it by votes, and you happen to have 5% Christians, they could be overwhelmed by the majority votes. But by having dhimma, or covenant, ingrained in the Quran, which is unchangeable, in the teaching of the Prophet, which is unchangeable, and a duty of the Muslim to follow on that, that means that this is irrevocable. Second aspect about covenanted people also, aside from being a contract, not a status, is that it is a different kind of contract also. It is an irrevocable, eternal contract. It can only be broken if a person, for example, become a Muslim, so there would be no need to classify him as dhimmi, and that's why it's open classification, not like classification by language, which you can change, or race. Or if the person leaves, chooses not to live with Muslims and join countries that are hostile and fighting against Muslims, in which case he have already chosen not to be a covenanted person. Another aspect is that this distinction, like I said earlier, not only protects the rights of minorities, which otherwise would not be there if there is no distinction like this. In fact, as I'll see later, it may even make some of the punishments that could be meted to Muslims not applicable to them. A Christian, for example, who drinks, according to many scholars, cannot have the punishment for drinking. So by having that distinction, actually would exempt him from the penalties that could be inflicted on a Muslim. The second point about the underpinning of Muslim attitude towards minorities. First of all is what we mentioned earlier in the morning presentation in Surah 17, the dignity of the human being as a human being. Two, the concept of human brotherhood as we find in Surah 49. I'm not going to repeat that, just a reminder. But I'd like to add to that also one important thing when people differ with you in religion. That appeared in Surah 60 in verses 8 and 9, in which it said, God does not forbid you, O Muslims, with respect to those who did not fight you because of your religion, or drive you out of your homes, that you should deal with them in kindness and justice, for God loves those who do good. It becomes not a matter of nicety, but a religious commitment and obligation to be kind to non-Muslim citizens living under Muslim protection if they are not hostile and working against them. Islam went further than theory, and even in its laws, it provides permission for the Muslim to eat the meat killed by people of the book, in particular Jews and Christians, but not others. It allowed even some form of intermarriage between Muslim and Christian. And since the Quran say that marriage is peace, tranquility, love and compassion, how could one say that Islam teaches Muslim to hate or mistreat non-Muslims if that non-Muslim could be his own wife? It's very simple, very logical. Furthermore, the Quran also removes this attitude of fanaticism. I'm not saying some people will not be fanatic, but the Quran itself removes that attitude by clearly stating that if God willed, He would have made people all one nation, means one religion. But it says God will test you in what He gave you, like Dr. Haddad also referred to some of these statements in the Quran, which means indeed that it tells Muslims, take it easy. Yes, there could be an issue of so-called theological correctness. A Muslim sees theological correctness in one way. وَمَنْ يَبْتَغِ غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ, like Dr. Haddad referred to, that Islam is the true faith of all the prophets, not only of Prophet Muhammad, of all of the prophets, and this is the true monotheistic faith. That is theological correctness in the mind of the Muslim. Theological correctness in the mind of the Christian, that God came in the form of a human to save mankind through His grace. Everybody considers himself correct theologically. But the Quran also teaches that there's a big difference, and that's where I respectfully disagree with Dr. Haddad. There is a difference between the fact that you believe in this as the truth, and this is the theologically correct thing for you, and to infer from that that because you are correct theologically, you have to mistreat somebody who is incorrect theologically. And these are two different things. Because the Quran always defers judgment to God in the Day of Judgment. In fact, one verse, لَيْسَ بِأَمَانِيِّكُمْ وَلَا أَمَانِيِّ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ. It's not by your wishful thinking, you Muslims, or wishful thinking of the people of the book. So theological correctness is for the Day of Judgment.